My name is Eleanor, and the day my husband told me I was nothing without him was the day I started to become someone new. He leaned across the dinner table, his wine glass catching the light, and said with a smirk that curled like smoke, "You live off me. Without me, you'd be lost." The words landed harder than the clatter of silverware, harder than the silence that followed. They sank into my chest heavy as stones, and yet, though they were meant to crush me, they planted something too, the seed of a reckoning. It didn't start with fury. It started with disbelief, the way you might react if a stranger insulted you on the street. But he wasn't a stranger. He was my husband of nearly 3 decades, the man whose hand I held in hospitals, the man I cooked 1,000 Sunday dinners for, the man I once believed had chosen me for life. When I tell you this story, I want you to picture it. Picture the warm glow of the dining room chandelier, the polished wood of the table we had bought together when we were young and hopeful. Picture our children grown, no longer filling the seats. It was just the two of us that night, and somehow, with fewer people around, he seemed louder, harsher, unmasked. "Eleanor," he said, his fork paused in midair, "do you even realize how easy your life is? You don't work. You don't build anything. Everything you have, it's because of me." I remember staring at the roast chicken on my plate, suddenly unable to swallow. My hands trembled slightly, but I forced them still against the linen napkin. Outwardly, I smiled the way women are trained to smile when they're humiliated in public or in private, small tight, dismissive, as if the wound were nothing but a scratch. Inside, though, I felt a slow bleed. And yet, if you looked at our life from the outside, you'd think it was a picture of success. We had a nice house with a wraparound porch, a business with his name on the letterhead, cars that gleamed in the driveway. People in town saw him as a man who'd made it. They'd see me beside him, smiling, nodding, the supportive wife, and they'd assume I had made it too. But appearances, as I would learn, are just stage props. Behind them, the truth can rot quietly. I had always been steady, the type to remember birthdays, keep the bills paid, volunteer at church. I was the glue, invisible, but necessary. He was the spark, the ambitious one, the storyteller, the man who commanded attention when he walked into a room. I didn't mind. In fact, I once thought we balanced each other, his fire, my calm. But balance tilts when one person starts weighing themselves as everything and the other as nothing. The comments began as jokes. At barbecues, he'd laugh and say, "Don't ask Eleanor about business, she just spends the money, she doesn't earn it." People chuckled, thinking it was light-hearted banter. I chuckled too, cheeks hot, because it was easier to laugh than to make a scene. Over the years, those little cuts deepened. "You don't need that dress. Who are you trying to impress? Let the younger folks handle that, honey. You'll wear yourself out. Travel's for people with energy, not bad knees." Each phrase chipped away at me, tiny chisels against the sculpture of my self-worth. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself he was stressed, that men of his age say things they don't mean. I whispered excuses into the dark, curled on my side of the bed, pretending sleep while he scrolled endlessly on his phone. But inside I was shrinking. There was one night I remember vividly. I had been flipping through a travel magazine, my fingers tracing the photographs of cobblestone streets, vineyards, sunlit piazzas. Italy. I'd always dreamed of seeing it. I looked up at him, hopeful, and said softly, "Maybe one day we could go together." He didn't even glance up from his phone. He snorted. "Italy's not for the old, Eleanor. Besides, you'd just slow me down." It wasn't just rejection, it was dismissal. As if the very thought of sharing that dream with me was absurd. That night, I cried in the bathroom with the door locked. The tiles were cold against my back as I slid down to the floor, muffling my sobs so he wouldn't hear. The words echoed in my head, cruel and casual, too old, slow me down. Still, I swallowed the hurt as I always did. I smoothed my face and smiled when we saw neighbors. I carried groceries, ironed his shirts, balanced the checkbook. I kept the performance alive because, after all, wasn't that my role? His wife. But the truth was seeping in. With every slight, every insult, I began to see the man behind the curtain, and what I saw wasn't a partner. It was a tyrant who fed on control. And then came the night he said the words that would stick like a thorn in my soul. "You live off me." It was no longer a joke at a party, no longer a jab slipped between chores. It was a declaration. He wanted me to believe it, to feel it, to bow my head under the weight of his supposed generosity. But here is what he didn't know: while those words stung, they also ignited something I had forgotten existed. A spark, a whisper that said, "You are not powerless. You are not a guest in your own life." I didn't act right away. Not then. But I began to listen to myself, to the silence between his words, to the years of unspoken sacrifice I had made. And slowly, piece by piece, I started to imagine another version of me. One that didn't need his permission. One that didn't need his name to feel whole. That seed was small, but it had been planted. And like all seeds, it only needed time and pressure to grow. When you live with someone for decades, you notice the shifts, even the ones they try to hide. You know the rhythm of their footsteps, the timbre of their laughter, the way they breathe when they're lying awake at night. That's why when my husband's habits began to change, I noticed before I was ready to admit it. It started small. His phone became an extension of his hand. Once he used to leave it charging on the counter screen, glowing with harmless notifications, work emails, news alerts, sometimes the kids' messages. Now it never left his side. He took it to the bathroom, to the garage, even to bed. If it buzzed, he turned away, thumb moving quick as if shielding state secrets. Then came the late nights. He'd claim the company needed him, that contracts were being finalized, or that investors wanted reassurance. I'd nod because what else could I do? But each time he slipped his keys into his pocket after dinner and muttered, "Don't wait up," a stone of suspicion lodged in my chest. I wanted to believe the best. That was always my instinct. After all, hadn't we built a life together? Raised children, weathered illnesses, scraped by in the lean years before the company thrived. Surely a man who shared all that with me couldn't simply cast me aside. And yet, I saw it: the extra grooming, the gym membership he never needed before, the cologne I didn't recognize clinging to his shirts. Sometimes when he walked through the door at midnight with a forced yawn and a sloppy excuse, I caught the faintest trace of perfume that wasn't mine. Not floral, not powdery, something younger, sharper, lingering in the air even after he showered. I swallowed it down just as I always had, but cracks have a way of widening no matter how much you try to plaster over them. One evening at a family dinner, those cracks gaped wider. I had been telling our grown children about a local art exhibit I wanted to see. I said I thought it might be nice to go together to do something a little different. He smirked across the table, fork dangling in his hand, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Why drag your mother along? She'd get tired halfway through. She doesn't really care about that sort of thing." The table went quiet. One of my daughters reached for my hand under the tablecloth, a small squeeze that spoke volumes. I smiled, brushing it off, pretending the jab rolled off me. But inside, I felt myself shrinking smaller and smaller until I wondered if I was even visible anymore. These moments accumulated like dust, small, constant, suffocating. A remark about my hair being too gray to bother with highlights. A dismissal when I tried to help with bookkeeping. A sigh when I asked if he'd join me for a walk. And always, always, the reminder that he was the one building, earning, thriving, while I merely lived off him. It wasn't just the words. It was the distance. I'd look at him and feel like I was watching someone behind glass, familiar in form, but unreachable. He was restless at home, impatient at the dinner table, distracted during conversations. When I asked about his day, he gave clipped answers, eyes darting back to his phone. Still, I clung to hope. Maybe it was stress. Maybe it was age. Maybe if we took that trip I'd dreamed about, Italy, or even just somewhere closer we could bridge the gap. I kept the dream alive in scraps brochures tucked into magazines, recipes from Tuscany clipped out of newspapers, a small stash of euros I once bought at a currency exchange just in case. But each time I hinted at it, he shut me down. Travel's too much of a hassle. You'd hate all the walking. We don't need to waste money on frivolities. Always excuses until eventually I stopped asking. What I didn't stop noticing, though, was the way he lit up around his secretary. She was half my age with a laugh that seemed to bounce off walls quick and bright. I'd seen her at company functions, always hovering nearby with a hand on his arm, always eager, always attentive. At first I brushed it off. Maybe she was just ambitious, eager to impress the boss. But then I saw it, the way his eyes followed her, the way he leaned in just a little closer than necessary. I told myself not to imagine things, but denial has a fragile shell. One day, it always cracks. That shell began to crack. The afternoon I stopped by the office to drop off lunch. I thought it would be a nice surprise, a reminder that despite the tension, I still cared. But when I walked in, she was there leaning over his desk, laughter spilling like honey, while his hand rested casually, too casually, on hers. They froze when they saw me. He snatched his hand back, clearing his throat with forced nonchalance. "Eleanor, what are you doing here?" I held up the lunch bag, my heart pounding like a drum in my ears. "I thought you might be hungry." His eyes darted to hers, then back to me. "That's thoughtful. Thank you." His tone was clipped, dismissive, as though my kindness embarrassed him. I left quickly, the lunch untouched, the sting of humiliation burning hotter than the summer sun outside. That was the moment I knew the cracks were no longer small enough to ignore. The facade of our marriage was crumbling, and all the years of smoothing things over couldn't patch it back together. Still, I didn't confront him. Not yet. Some part of me clung to the hope that I was wrong, that I had misunderstood. But deep down, a voice I had long silenced was starting to whisper louder. "Pay attention. You are not imagining this. Something is breaking, and it's not you. It's him." I folded that voice away for later, pressing it down like a letter I wasn't ready to read. But the cracks were there, widening every day. And soon they would split wide open. The day I learned the truth was ordinary in every way, except for what it revealed. It was a Tuesday, bright but unremarkable, the kind of day when laundry hums in the machine and the scent of lemon cleaner lingers in the kitchen. I was folding towels when he came through the door, brisk and preoccupied, muttering about schedules and deadlines. "I'll be out of town for 2 weeks," he said, rifling through his briefcase. "Meetings in Chicago." "Don't wait up." "Chicago?" I asked, still smoothing a towel. He hadn't mentioned it before. "Yes, Chicago," he repeated, but his tone was impatient, dismissive, as though the word were too heavy for his lips. And then he slipped. "Italy meetings. I mean, European clients." The towel dropped from my hands. Italy. The one dream I had carried close for decades, the trip I had begged him to take with me, brushed aside as too impractical, too tiring, too expensive. Now he spoke of it like a chore, a trivial errand. "Italy," I echoed, trying to steady my voice. He waved me off. "Work. You wouldn't enjoy it. Too much walking, too much noise. You'd just slow me down." Slow me down. The words rang in my ears, sharp and familiar. I stood there, dish towel crumpled in my hand, staring at the man who had once been my partner. He didn't even try for kindness anymore. It wasn't about protecting me or sparing me. It was about erasing me from the picture. Later that evening, as he stepped out to take a call, I heard it, the softness in his voice, the kind that used to be reserved for me. "Don't worry," he murmured, low and intimate. "We'll be together the whole time." And then, clear as the toll of a bell, her name, his secretary's name. I sat in the living room, cold seeping into my bones. The truth was no longer a suspicion, no longer a shadow in the corner of my mind. It was here, undeniable, spoken aloud in his own voice. He was taking her to Italy. My Italy. That night I didn't cry. Oddly enough, tears wouldn't come. Instead, a stillness spread through me like the hush before a storm. Anger simmered beneath it, yes, but stronger still was clarity. For years I had smoothed over his insults, tucked away my dreams, ignored the cracks. I had told myself I was protecting the family, keeping the peace. But peace built on silence is a fragile thing, and now it had shattered completely. The next morning, I moved through the house like an observer seeing it with new eyes. The framed photographs I had arranged with care, the meals I had cooked, the laundry folded, the life held together with my invisible labor. He dismissed it as nothing, as living off him, but it was everything. Without me, the threads would have unraveled long ago. I poured myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad as though I were a student again. Instead of groceries or chores, I wrote a list of leverage: the company, the accounts, the house deed, the car, the pension. For decades, I had treated these things as ours. Now I began to see them differently. They were mine too, earned through years of sacrifice, of raising children, of holding the home steady while he built his empire. I hesitated at first. Could I really do this? Could I really step out of the role I had played for so long? But then I remembered his words. You live off me. And the sting hardened into resolve. That afternoon, I visited my neighbor Margaret, a widow who had known me since before the marriage. She looked at me closely, noting the tightness around my mouth. You look tired, she said gently. Is everything all right? For once, I didn't plaster on the polite smile. I shook my head and she reached out, squeezing my hand. Don't let him make you small, Eleanor. You've got more strength than you know. Her words were simple, but they landed deep. Maybe it was because she had seen me before the marriage, before I shrank myself to fit his world. Maybe it was because she said it without pity, only certainty. That night, while he slept, I sat again in the living room, the notepad before me. I stared at the list, each item a piece of leverage, a step toward freedom. My Italy had been stolen, yes, but there were other kinds of journeys, ones I could take without ever boarding a plane. The betrayal burned, but beneath it something else stirred. A whisper that said, "You are not powerless. You are not done." I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: when he returned from Italy, he would not come home to the same woman he left behind. When you've been dismissed for long enough, when your worth has been chipped away year after year, you eventually reach a point where you either collapse or you fight back. For me, the shift was almost invisible even to myself at first. But once the truth about Italy lodged in my chest, something inside me steadied. I wasn't going to collapse this time. I began quietly. No dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches in the kitchen. Instead, I retreated into myself, into thought and calculation. I had spent decades organizing birthdays, balancing checkbooks, keeping schedules, smoothing every wrinkle in our family life. Why not turn that same discipline toward something else, toward reclaiming my freedom? The first step was information. I pulled out old file folders, papers tucked neatly in cabinets and drawers, deed statements, account balances. My hands trembled as I spread them across the dining room table, but not from fear, from recognition. This was not his alone. This was ours. Mine. Each document was proof that I had contributed, that my years of unpaid labor had value. The company papers were the most daunting. His name was bold on every letterhead, but I knew the truth of its early days. I had poured sweat into those beginnings, answering phones, drafting invoices, even baking muffins for employees when paychecks were late. It wasn't just his company. It was ours. My fingerprints were there, invisible but undeniable. I began making lists just as I had with groceries. Only this time the items weren't milk and eggs. They were leverage points. The company. His pride and joy, but half of it was legally mine. Joint accounts. Every dollar he assumed would always be at his disposal. The house. My name sat next to his on the deed. The pension, built across decades with my sacrifices woven into each contribution. The car, not just a vehicle but his vanity, his symbol of youth. I stared at the list for hours, my pen tapping against the paper. For years, these things had seemed like background scenery props in the play of our marriage. But now they looked like tools. The doubt crept in at first. Was I capable of this? Could I, the quiet wife, the one who smoothed everything over, really take such steps? I felt guilt, a heavy stone in my stomach, as though I were betraying him. But then I remembered his words, the sneer in his voice. You live off me. If anyone had betrayed vows, it was him, not me. One morning, I put on my simplest cardigan and walked into a lawyer's office. My heart pounded so hard I thought the receptionist might hear it. The lawyer was a woman, sharp-eyed, confident, maybe a decade younger than me. She listened as I spilled everything, the insults, the Italy trip, the mistress. My voice shook at first, but as I spoke, steadiness returned. When I finished, she nodded. You've already done the hardest part, she said. You've decided you're done. The rest is just paperwork. Her calm confidence washed over me like balm. Paperwork. What he would dismiss as trivial was now the very weapon I would use to untangle myself from him. That night, I cooked dinner as usual, setting plates on the table, smiling when he muttered about deadlines. Outwardly, I played the same role, but inside, I was different. Inside, I was a strategist, mapping every move. I also confided in my sister, whom I hadn't visited in years because he always complained she talked too much. We sat on her porch drinking iced tea, the evening cicadas humming. When I told her what I was planning, she looked at me long and hard, then broke into a smile. I always knew you had fire in you, she said. He tried to bury it, but it's still there. Her words bolstered me. I wasn't acting out of spite. I wasn't being reckless. I was claiming what was mine finally. From then on, each day carried a dual purpose. Outwardly, I maintained the facade, cooking meals, watering plants, tidying rooms. Inwardly, I laid groundwork. Phone calls, meetings, quiet notes in a journal I kept hidden under sweaters in my dresser. I felt like two women at once, the obedient wife he thought he still owned, and the strategist he never saw coming. In small moments, I began to test my new strength. At the bank, I asked questions about joint accounts, my voice steady. At the company, I requested old records under the guise of cleaning. No one questioned me. After all, hadn't I always been the one to keep things in order? Each piece of information slid into place like puzzle pieces, and with every step my fear lessened, replaced by something sharper, anticipation. The irony wasn't lost on me. While he packed suitcases for Italy, envisioning gondolas and vineyard sunsets with his mistress, I was building my own itinerary, one that didn't require a passport. Mine was a journey toward freedom, toward dignity, toward a future where I wasn't a shadow in my own home. By the end of that week, the plan was clear in my mind. Sell the car, move the money, secure my share of the company, file for divorce. Each step deliberate, each one a stone in the path away from him. I looked at the man across from me at dinner, his eyes glued to his phone, his mind already thousands of miles away. He didn't see me anymore, but soon, very soon, he would. Because when he returned from Italy, he would not find the submissive wife he left behind. He would find a woman who had remembered her worth, a woman who had reclaimed her power. The first move was the hardest, not because of the act itself, but because of what it symbolized. His car, sleek, polished, the gleaming emblem of his pride, wasn't just metal and rubber. It was an altar to his vanity. He waxed it on weekends with more tenderness than he ever gave to me. Selling it wasn't about money. It was about sending a message, even if he wouldn't hear it until much later. I called a dealer I trusted, a man from church who had always been fair. When he came by to inspect the car, I stood with my arms folded, watching as he ran his hand over the hood. It's in excellent shape, he said. Of course it is, I replied. He took better care of it than anything else. The dealer looked at me, eyebrows raised, but didn't comment. He named a price. I didn't haggle. I just signed the papers, handed over the keys, and stood in the driveway as the car rolled away. For a moment, my knees threatened to buckle. Then, as the taillights disappeared down the road, something loosened inside me. It was as if chains had fallen from my wrists. The next step was the accounts. I dressed in my plainest clothes, a cardigan and sensible shoes, and walked into the bank carrying my tote bag as though it held nothing but errands. The teller, a young woman with kind eyes, greeted me warmly. "I'd like to make a withdrawal," I said. "How much today?" she asked, fingers poised above her keyboard. "All of it," I answered. She blinked, uncertain. "All of it?" "Yes," I said, steady now. "Every dollar in our joint accounts. They belong to me as much as to him." Her gaze softened with something like understanding. "Of course," she said quietly. Minutes later, she handed me a cashier's check. I slipped it into my tote and walked out taller than when I had walked in. He had always assumed I was too timid to touch the money, that I wouldn't dare. But every dollar represented years of my labor, raising children, keeping house, supporting his career. It was mine as much as his. For once, I wasn't asking permission. The company was more complicated. I met with the lawyer again, her sharp eyes flicking over the documents I brought. "You've done your homework," she said. "I spent decades running a household on scraps of information," I replied. "Turns out I'm good at piecing things together." She smiled at that, then grew serious. "We can secure your share legally. We'll move quickly." Those meetings were both terrifying and exhilarating. Sitting in that office, I felt like I was reclaiming lost years, like I was rewriting the narrative he had always imposed, that he was the builder and I was the dependent. The truth was clearer than ever. I had built too. I had invested my life, and now I was ready to withdraw. The final step was filing for divorce. The lawyer slid the papers across the desk, her pen resting on top. My hand hovered for a moment. Divorce. A word I had once feared, a word that had felt like failure. Now it tasted like liberation. I signed. When I left her office, the autumn wind whipped against my cheeks, crisp and cool. I pulled my coat tighter and realized I was smiling. Not a forced smile, not the polite mask I had worn for years, but a genuine one. Meanwhile, he called from Italy. The first time, his voice was rushed, distracted. "Everything fine back home?" he asked, as though I were merely the caretaker of the house, not his partner of decades. "Everything is fine," I answered, leaving out the details of cars sold, accounts emptied, papers filed. On another call, I heard her laughter in the background. He tried to muffle the phone, but it was too late. My heart didn't break this time. It hardened. He believed I was still the naive wife, blind and dependent, waiting for his return. He had no idea the ground beneath him was already gone. At home, I began to carve out small rituals of freedom. I sat in the quiet of the morning with coffee brewed just for me, no scrambling to make his eggs just so. I signed up for a painting class at the community center, brush in hand color spilling onto canvas. I even joined a group of friends for a day trip to the coast, walking the boardwalk, eating fried clams, laughing until my cheeks ached. Each step reminded me I was capable of joy on my own. Each day without his shadow grew lighter. But make no mistake, this wasn't just about finding myself. It was about preparing, about laying the groundwork so that when he returned from Italy, drunk on romance and arrogance, expecting his old life to be waiting, he would find nothing the same. He would walk through the door to discover his car gone, his accounts empty, his wife no longer docile, but resolute, divorce papers already filed. I imagined his face often, that moment of dawning realization. It carried me through the days like fuel. And so while he strolled through piazzas and sipped wine with his mistress, I was here building my freedom. He thought Italy was his triumph, but it was my beginning. The day of his return felt almost cinematic. as though the universe itself had orchestrated it for maximum impact. I woke early, though I hadn't set an alarm. The house was silent, bathed in the thin light of dawn. I moved through the room, steady and deliberate, setting everything in its place, not for him, but for me. Fresh flowers on the table. The divorce papers stacked neatly where he would see them. The silence itself felt like an ally, thick with anticipation. By afternoon, the air outside had turned brisk, the kind that makes leaves crunch underfoot. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and waited. Not nervously, not fearfully, but with the calm certainty of a woman who has rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times. When the taxi finally pulled into the driveway, I didn't flinch. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel, the slam of a car door, the faint drag of his suitcase wheels. Then the front door swung open, and there he was, tanned from the Mediterranean sun, smelling of cologne. I didn't recognize his shirt unbuttoned just enough to suggest he wanted to look younger than he was. "Well," he said, tossing his suitcase down, "home sweet home." I studied him for a long moment. He looked smug, almost boyish in his arrogance, the swagger of a man who believed he had fooled everyone. But as his gaze flicked toward the driveway, I saw at the first crack in his confidence. The driveway was empty. No sleek car gleamed in its usual spot. "Where's the car?" he asked, his voice sharp now. "Sold," I said calmly, my hands folded on the table. He blinked, his face tightening. "You what?" "I sold it," I repeated, my tone even. "It's gone." He laughed, a short, incredulous bark. "That car was worth—" "It was worth exactly what I got for it," I interrupted. "And the money is mine now." His eyes narrowed. "The money." "All of it," I said, meeting his gaze. "The accounts. Every last dollar. Transferred. Safe. Not waiting for you and her to sip champagne in Rome." The color drained from his face, replaced by a mix of fury and disbelief. He stepped forward, fists clenched. "You can't do this. I won't allow it." I laughed then, not cruelly, but freely, a sound I hadn't made in years. "You won't allow it. That's the problem, isn't it? You've spent decades thinking I needed your permission, but I don't. Not anymore. The papers are filed. The lawyers are handling it. You don't get to allow or forbid anything in my life again." He staggered back as though the words had physical weight. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no sound came. Finally he spat. "You ungrateful, bitter—" "Stop," I said, raising a hand. My voice didn't shake. "For years I swallowed your insults. I let you shrink me down until I barely recognized myself. But I'm done. I'm not too old. I'm not too weak. I'm not too small. I am done." The silence that followed was unlike any we had ever shared. For the first time in our marriage, I had the last word, and he knew it. His bravado cracked then, though he tried to patch it with threats. "I'll fight you. I'll drag you through court. You'll regret this." But there was no fire in it, no conviction. His bluff had been called, and he had no cards left. Finally, with a furious jerk, he grabbed his suitcase. "You'll be nothing without me," he snarled. I stood tall, my voice steady. "On the contrary," I said softly, "without you, I am finally something." The door slammed behind him, rattling the frame, but I didn't flinch. I stood in the quiet, breathing deeply, letting the silence settle around me like a warm cloak. For the first time in decades, the house wasn't filled with his criticisms, his sighs, his demands. It was filled with peace. I sat back at the kitchen table, the very place where I had once cried over his cruel jokes, and let the quiet seep in. There were no tears this time, no fear, only relief. The reckoning was over. He had left expecting to return to a loyal, diminished wife, someone who would forgive or crumble. Instead, he had returned to a woman reborn, a woman who had finally remembered her own strength. And though he walked out furious, defeated, and lost, I knew one thing with absolute certainty: I had won. After the door slammed, I stood in the silence for a long time, the kind of silence that used to feel like loneliness, but now felt like freedom. My chest rose and fell slowly, almost cautiously, as though my body was testing what it meant to live without his shadow pressing against it. The first morning without him, I brewed coffee just for myself. No rushing to fry eggs exactly the way he liked them. No ironing his shirts before he stomped into the kitchen. I sat at the table by the window, the mug warm in my hands, and listened. Birds, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the house settling. No sighs of disapproval, no sarcastic remarks. Just life, plain and unadorned, and it was enough. That day I opened the windows wide. The house seemed to exhale with me. I brought out the photographs he'd insisted I hide, pictures of the kids, as toddlers messy with finger paint, our grandchildren with frosting on their cheeks. Snapshots of me and my sister laughing until tears ran down our faces. I set them proudly on the mantel. These were the moments worth remembering, not his scowls or his derision. Slowly, I began to fill the house with pieces of myself. Music I loved, but he mocked. Lavender candles he claimed gave him headaches. Stacks of novels he had once dismissed as fluff. Every small choice was an act of reclamation. My home was mine again. But it wasn't only about the house, it was about me. I went back to my garden, kneeling in the soil, hands dirty, sun warming my back. I planted tomatoes, basil, lavender. Each green sprout pushing through the earth felt like a declaration growth is always possible no matter the season. I also enrolled in that painting class I had once brushed aside as impractical. The first time I touched brush to canvas, I felt awkward, clumsy, but then something sparked. The teacher, a kind man with paint on his jeans, looked at my work and said, "You've got an eye for this." I hadn't heard words like that in years. They weren't about my usefulness, my service to someone else. They were about me, my talent, my expression. I reconnected with old friends too. Women I hadn't seen in years because he always complained they talked too much or wasted time. We met for lunches that stretched into afternoons, laughing until our cheeks ached. I visited my sister more often, sitting on her porch with iced tea as cicadas sang in the twilight. She told me, "You've got more fight in you than he ever gave you credit for." She was right. Loneliness did creep in at times. Nights when the bed felt too big, mornings when I wished for another voice to greet me. But even those moments were lighter than the constant weight of living with someone who made me feel small. Solitude, I learned, was not emptiness. Sometimes solitude was freedom. I heard about him now and then. Whispers from acquaintances, fragments of gossip. His secretary hadn't stayed with him long, his charm wore thin once the novelty faded. He lost more than money in the divorce. He lost his image, his standing, his confidence. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Life has a way of catching up to people like him. What mattered wasn't his downfall, it was my rise. One evening, sitting on my porch as the sun dipped low, I thought of Italy again. For decades, it had been my dream, the canals, the vineyards, the art. For so long, I had pinned my hope on him joining me, on us sharing it together. Now I realized I didn't need him, or even Italy, to feel whole. Maybe I'd go someday, maybe not. It no longer mattered. Because the truth was simple, I had already found what I was looking for. Myself. And so if you're listening to this, wherever you are, maybe in your living room, maybe at your kitchen table, maybe alone in your car, I want you to know something. Don't let anyone convince you that you're too old to dream, too small to matter, too dependent to stand tall. Those are lies meant to keep you quiet. If my story has shown me anything, it's that age isn't a cage. It can be a key if you choose to use it. So tell me, where are you watching from today? I like to imagine your towns, your cozy chairs, the lives you're living. Maybe you'll hear my story and remember your own strength too. Because when he went to Italy, he thought he was leaving me behind, thought he was trading me for something shinier, younger, easier. But when he came home, he found nothing waiting for him: no car, no money, no obedient wife. And though he thought Italy would be his triumph, it turned out to be mine. Because Italy without me was just a trip. But Italy without him, that was the beginning of my freedom. If this story touched you, I'd love for you to share it, to leave a thought, or to subscribe, so we can keep reminding each other that it's never too late to choose yourself.